When a skyscraper falls, it's rarely a sudden explosion, right? It's usually a sinking foundation. Today, we're doing a critique on a piece that argues the global compliance tech market is failing because it's built on a sinking foundation of legacy data transmission rather than continuous architectural transformation.
Yeah, that's exactly the core of it.
And addressing the practical constraints of migrating away from deeply entrenched legacy systems will significantly fortify the overall argument here. The material is aimed at a really sophisticated enterprise audience, CFOs, CIOs, and it spends a lot of time deconstructing these ERP-embedded models and those M&A patchwork architectures.
It really does, and that's laid out super clearly. I do wonder, though, if we fully considered the actual reality of the enterprise environment here. Because, the author effectively tears down the current vendor models, but there's this assumption woven through the text that these companies are operating with a blank slate.
Right, and absolutely no multinational enterprise has a blank slate.
Exactly. If I'm reading this and I'm a CIO, I'm acutely aware of my sunk costs. Like, I have massive switching costs, I am locked into multi-year contracts, and my board is probably incredibly risk-averse.
Yeah, so is the connection between identifying the trap and practically escaping it fully established in the material? Or is that an area to potentially bolster? Because right now, honestly, it feels like the text diagnoses a fatal disease, points to a hospital on top of a mountain, and just assumes the patient can instantly teleport there.
Oh, that is a massive gap, because the material makes a really strong case for why the current systems fail. It highlights things like the customer-side complexity transfer.
Right.
And it rightfully notes that adding a 15th jurisdiction is basically just as much work as adding the first, since each country requires a standalone integration. But if I'm running a global supply chain, I can't just rip out my ERP's compliance module overnight without completely halting operations.
No, you definitely can't. So if I'm the author, I'm inserting a transitional framework right here. The weakness is that they just skip over the friction of switching architectures. We have to guide the reader on how to actually untangle the mess without, breaking their ongoing financial operations.
I can definitely see what you're going for there. Let's see how we can actually strengthen this on the page. Because telling a multinational enterprise to simply move to a canonical data model, it sounds great in theory, but I'm a little fuzzy on how they actually sequence that. If they build an external orchestration layer, how is that not just adding another piece of middleware?
Right, like another point of failure?
Exactly.
That is a great question, and it's exactly what the reader's going to be thinking. The text needs a dedicated stepping stone section to explain the actual mechanism of this transition. You have to explain to the CIO that it's not just a dumb pipe or a standard middleware router.
So what does that look like practically?
Well, step 1 is mapping your current custom XML code. Then step 2 is pointing your ERP outputs to an agnostic middle layer. And step 3 is where the magic really happens. You begin routing your new jurisdictions through the canonical model.
Ah, okay.
Right. And that model translates those local XML quirks into a universal language before it even hits your core ERP. And the whole time, you leave the legacy integrations alone temporarily.
Okay, but wait. Doesn't running a new system for new jurisdictions and while leaving the old ones intact kind of create the exact patchwork architecture the author is arguing against?
That totally makes sense. But could the evidence also support a different conclusion? Like, what if we view this as a deliberate, phased orchestration rather than a permanent patchwork? Because a patchwork implies disparate systems that don't speak to each other, just glued together by manual processes.
That's true.
A transitional orchestration layer centralizes the data standard. It's a temporary bridge. The author needs to clearly define this difference so the CIO knows they are building a bridge, not just adding another isolated island.
Okay, so we are essentially decoupling the custom transformation code from the ERP piece by piece. What does that look like geographically, though? Because launching a global canonical model all at once across, say, 50 countries sounds like a catastrophic risk.
It really does. Building on that point, what if we looked at it from the perspective of an isolated pilot program? A concrete example would be for the author to introduce a specific paragraph on running a clean core pilot.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. Let's say Spain introduces a new real-time e-invoicing mandate.
The text should advise the CIO to use Spain as the isolated testbed for the new canonical platform.
Right, so you don't even touch the legacy systems in France or Germany. You just prove the architecture in Spain.
Exactly.
And if it works and the integration cost for that single jurisdiction drops because the canonical model handled the translation natively, then you have your proof of concept. You can just roll it out globally at your own pace.
Yeah, it grounds the theoretical solution in the actual messy reality of enterprise IT. It proves the author actually understands how terrifying it is to change the tires on a moving truck.
For sure. Okay, so let's assume the CIO buys into this transitional roadmap, right? They are willing to run the pilot in Spain. That brings us to what they are actually transitioning to. Grounding the description of this ideal architecture with tangible, real-world metrics will amplify its persuasive power for a highly skeptical executive audience.
This is such a critical area for refinement. The text is incredibly visceral when it's describing the failure modes. The reader basically feels the operational pain of the pre-formatted trap, where their IT team is bleeding resources writing custom code for vendor input requirements.
Yeah, it's very vivid.
But the weakness is, when we get to the section titled What the Right Architecture Looks Like, the tone just shifts dramatically. It becomes highly theoretical.
It really does. So a key theme running through this material seems to be the stark contrast between the flawed, heavily detailed legacy systems of today and then this abstract ideal state of tomorrow.
Yes.
The author asserts that this new architecture accepts raw, standard transactional data and maintains a canonical data model. They even explicitly write that this is not a theoretical aspiration.
But simply telling a deeply technical audience that something isn't theoretical doesn't actually make it real. It lacks the empirical weight that characterizes the entire first half of the piece.
To me, it feels a bit like the author is explaining forced coupling by saying, it's like trying to play a vinyl record on a native digital streaming app by using a complex series of physical adapters. We intuitively understand why that creates friction, skipping, terrible audio quality.
Right, the analogy works.
But then when they describe the solution, they just say, well, the new way is native digital. We need to actually prove the digital stream works without buffering.
Exactly. We need to replace the adjectives with hard numbers. As a concrete suggestion, the author has to balance these abstract requirements of a canonical data model with quantifiable evidence showing exactly how this architecture performs in the wild under the stress of modern compliance mandates.
I hear that, but I'm going to push back just a little bit on behalf of the author here. If I'm writing a high-level authoritative thought leadership piece, I feel like the last thing I want to do is start throwing in ROI statistics. It instantly cheapens the material. It turns a strategic architectural manifesto into like a vendor's sales brochure.
Okay, that's a very valid concern. Is there a risk that focusing solely on ROI might dilute the intellectual rigor of the piece? Yes, definitely. But we don't need to frame it as financial ROI. We are providing empirical proof of architectural superiority. It's about operational physics, not just dollars saved.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's look closely at the section discussing continuous transaction controls, or CTCs. The author points out that under a fragmented architecture, data crossing the boundary between a document exchange system and a tax calculation system introduces latency.
Right. And latency in a real-time clearance environment isn't just a mild IT annoyance, it is a business-stopping event. Think about it. If a truck is waiting at a border in Latin America for a digital invoice to clear the government server, and the architecture takes seconds to process that clearance because it has to translate XML formats back and forth across a boundary,
that truck literally doesn't move.
Exactly. It doesn't move.
So instead of just writing, forced coupling introduces latency, we need to explain why that latency exists and then quantify the alternative.
Right.
And a tax engine are built on fundamentally different databases. So when they're forced to communicate, data has to be extracted, sent over an API, validated, returned, and then re-injected.
Precisely. And that entire mechanism takes time. So a concrete example of how to fix this would be adding a specific operational metric here. The author could say something like, while forced coupled architectures often measure processing delays in seconds, which is a critical liability in real-time clearance environments, a unified canonical architecture processes the validation natively.
And they could add that it executes the same clearance in, say, under 20 milliseconds.
Yes.
That is a staggering difference. And you're right. It has nothing to do with a sales pitch. It's an engineering metric. It literally proves the architecture functions at the speed required by the new regulatory environment.
And you can actually apply this exact same quantifiable approach to the implementation side as well. Like, the author could include a single anonymized sentence, something like, when an enterprise transitions from a pre-formatted trap to a canonical platform, the engineering hours required for a new jurisdiction activation typically drop by 40 to 60%.
Because the canonical model mathematically eliminates the need for 50 separate point-to-point integrations. It maps the local data once to the universal core.
Exactly. You explain the how, and then you validate it with the how much.
I love that. Let's pivot to the human element here, though. Because even if you build a flawless transitional roadmap and back up the new architecture with bulletproof latency metrics, you still have a human being reading this text. Softening the absolutist tone regarding vendor failures by acknowledging the evolutionary nature of these technologies can create a much more receptive mindset for the reader.
This is probably the most crucial psychological adjustment the piece needs. The language currently used to describe the legacy systems is unyieldingly negative.
Oh, it is.
We have phrases like trap, failure mode, unintelligent messenger, and category error just scattered throughout the pages.
Right. And as an objective synthesizer of information, I read those terms and I think, okay, the author is being analytically precise. But if I'm reading this as a CFO who literally just signed a $20 million check to implement an ERP embedded compliance module 3 years ago, I am going to have a very, very different reaction.
You're going to feel totally attacked.
Absolutely. If I read that my flagship IT initiative is a category error and a failure mode, my arms are instantly crossed. I am going to actively look for reasons to reject the premise of the entire article simply out of professional self-preservation. I literally can't absorb the insight if I'm busy defending my past decisions.
That's a fascinating angle. What are the potential limitations or counter-arguments to that idea, though? Because the architectures are fundamentally flawed for the current real-time environment. The author isn't wrong in their diagnosis, so shouldn't they be as blunt as possible to wake the reader up?
Well, there is a difference between waking someone up and backing them into a corner. I mean, the material does briefly mention that these designs were historically common, but that tiny concession gets completely buried under the sheer weight of the failure mode labeling. It reads like an indictment of the buyer's intelligence.
Is there a risk that focusing solely on the structural flaws of these architectures today might overlook the fact that maybe 5 to 10 years ago they were actually the most rational choices available?
Yes, exactly. 10 years ago, the regulatory environment was entirely different. It was the transmission-only era. Governments really just wanted a summary report at the end of the month. They didn't require real-time invoice-by-invoice validation. So buying an unintelligent messenger to just batch send PVS was exactly what the CFO should have done.
So if I'm the author, I need to actively reframe these so-called failures as necessary historical stepping stones. We need to validate the reader's past choices. You basically shift the blame from the executive's poor decision-making to the massive shift in the global regulatory weather.
It's like telling someone who bought a world-class snowmobile 5 years ago that they didn't make a mistake. They bought the best machine for the environment, but global warming hit, all the snow melted, and now they are trying to drive a snowmobile on a dirt road.
Right.
The machine isn't a failure. It's just an evolutionary mismatch for the new terrain.
I love that analogy. So how do we actually implement this tonal shift in the text without losing the urgency?
Well, as a concrete suggestion, first we attack the nomenclature. Instead of calling them failure modes or traps in every single heading, the author should introduce them as evolutionary dead ends or legacy paradigms.
That is a vital distinction. Trap implies the CFO was foolish enough to get caught by a slick vendor, but evolutionary dead end implies a natural technological progression that simply ran its course. It's an objective observation about the passage of time.
Yeah, and to really solidify this psychological safety for the reader, the author needs to add a powerful qualifying sentence early on, like right before they dive into dissecting the 5 legacy architectures. Something like, if you implemented an ERP native solution 5 years ago, you made the exact right strategic choice for that regulatory climate.
And then follow it up with, but as mandates radically shift toward real-time financial intelligence, that once optimal architecture has become a severe strategic constraint.
Exactly. Because then you align the author and the reader on the exact same side of the table. They are looking at the problem together, nodding in agreement about how much the environment has changed, rather than the author pointing a finger across the table at the reader's past mistakes.
It actually reinforces the author's core thesis even more effectively. The whole point of the piece is that compliance is no longer about static document transmission, right? It's about continuous architectural intelligence. By framing the legacy systems as perfectly fine for the old world, you emphasize just how drastically we have entered a new world. You amplify the urgency of the future by softening the attack on the past.
We've covered some really critical ground here today. The foundation of this submitted material is exceptionally strong. The author has a deep, intricate understanding of how the global compliance technology market is structurally failing to meet the demands of continuous transaction controls.
Definitely.
But to elevate this from a sharp diagnostic essay into a truly persuasive executive mandate, the author needs to bridge the gap between theory and reality. So let's recap those actionable steps.
First, they have to build that transitional roadmap. You can't just tell a CIO to jump to a canonical data model. You have to show them the stepping stones. Explain how an agnostic orchestration layer allows them to pilot a single jurisdiction, like Spain, without ripping the engine out of their global ERP.
Right. And second, back up the ideal state with empirical mechanics. Adjectives just won't convince a skeptic. Explain why incompatible system boundaries cause latency, and then prove the superiority of the unified platform with hard numbers like reducing engineering activation hours by 40% or dropping processing latency down to 20 milliseconds.
And finally, give the reader a psychological out. Tone down the failure mode language. Reframe these deeply entrenched legacy systems as evolutionary dead ends. Validate the CFO's past investments as historically rational decisions for a bygone era, which naturally lowers their defensive shields and actually opens their mind to your solution.
If the author can implement these structural and tonal shifts, this piece won't just inform the market, it genuinely has the potential to actively redirect it. We warmly invite the author to apply these changes, flesh out those technical mechanisms, and submit the revised work back in for another critique. We always thrive on seeing how these frameworks evolve, because ultimately, you can't save a sinking skyscraper just by pointing at the cracks in the concrete. You have to hand the engineers a blueprint for a phase reinforcement, prove the new materials can bear the weight, and reassure everyone that the old foundation did exactly what it was supposed to do right up until the ground beneath it changed forever.